Hello, everybody. My name is Aurélie Decker. I'm the director of FC, the European Federation for Services to Individuals. Let me give you a warm welcome to the 10th anniversary European event of the ILO Domestic Workers Convention 189. I'm very happy to see so many of you today joining the event. Before we move into our introductory discussion, a few housekeeping bits and pieces, if I may. Interpretation in English, French, German, Italian, Polish, Romanian, and Spanish is provided and can be activated by clicking the globe button at the bottom right of your screen. Please disregard the Chinese channel. The whole event is recorded and will be shared for those unable to attend. All camera features for participants as well as their microphones are switched off. Now, if you have wonderful thoughts, questions along the way, feel free to type that in the chat. All questions to the panelists can be submitted to the Q&A box. We will be moderating that, and if we have time, moderators will do their best to address all your questions and your thoughts during the various panels. And if you have technical concern, send us a Zoom chat. We have Renaud and Dimitri on standby to help you with your technical concern. So we will now broadcast a short video prepared by IDWF, the International Domestic Workers Federation. This video takes us back into the unique atmosphere of the adoption of the Domestic Workers Convention 10 years ago.
My name is Esther Stevens, and I'm a full-time domestic worker.
I would like to thank everyone involved in the negotiations for the Convention for Domestic Workers during the last 2 weeks. The technical group and all the delegates, we have shown ILO that unity, commitment, and hard work can make a difference.
Domestic workers need a convention. Domestic workers need a convention. Domestic workers need a convention. Domestic workers in the ILO.
In November of 2006, domestic workers from around the world gathered in Amsterdam to discuss how they could organize internationally to have their rights to decent working conditions recognized.
The International Domestic Workers Network led the coordination of the Decent Work for Domestic Workers global campaign and linked domestic workers organizations locally, nationally, regionally, and internationally.
Are you listening, governments? Are you listening, governments?
We haven't reached the end of the road yet. What we believe, and like we said when we came here, we're not going back to our countries without a convention. And we firmly believe that we are going to get that.
I will call all of us a movement of the people. The movement of the people is a tremendous movement. That's where the real power resides.
Abstention 63. Majorité des 2/3 275. Le quorum est
On June 16, 2011, the governments, employers, and workers present at the 100th International Labor Conference, held in Geneva, Switzerland, adopted the first convention and accompanying recommendations on decent work for domestic workers.
A little step for the ILO, a big step for humanity.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.
Well, so the video speaks for itself and demonstrates the achievement that the adoption of the convention was, as well as the expectation it raised. To date, 8 member states have ratified the convention, and despite the global mobilization that follows its adoption, the issue of improving domestic and care workers' rights remain more than ever a topical issue. This is why, building on previous collaboration and work, such as the Add PHS project, workers, employers, and civil society representatives involved directly and indirectly in the sector decided to join forces and created the C189 European Alliance. Members of the Alliance are EISPD, European Association of Service Providers for Persons with Disabilities, EFAT, European Federation of Food, Agriculture and Tourism Trade Unions, EFE, European Federation for Family Employment and Home Care, FC, European Federation for Services to Individuals, IDWF, International Domestic Workers Federation, PICOM, the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, and UniEuropa, the European Trade Union Federation for Service Workers. We are very grateful to be joined and supported both by the European Commission and the International Labour Organization Office for the European Union and the Benelux countries in this attempt to mark an important milestone, to take stock of the progress made and the remaining issues in the European Union. I would like to express my gratitude to all partners of the Alliance as they made this event and the many initiatives surrounding it possible. So, what can we say about domestic work in Europe? There are nearly 9.5 million domestic workers working in the EU 27, and 19% of them are women. Also termed personal and household services, PHS workers at the EU level, domestic workers are workers who perform domestic work within an employment relationships and on an occupational basis in or for a households or several households. They are not a homogeneous group of workers, with workers having diverse work arrangements and employment relationships, as well as nationalities, residence statuses, and personal characteristics. The tasks they perform also vary significantly in terms of work content, as they provide both direct care, so care for elderly, persons with disabilities or children, and indirect care, such as cleaning and housekeeping. The high number of women in the sector, coupled with the historical notion that this work is unpaid, has left it outside of the regulatory frameworks for a very long time. Among the 9.5 million domestic workers in the EU, only 6.3 million of them are declared and presumably benefiting from labor rights and social protection coverage as other workers in other sectors. Despite several policy measures and other initiatives over the past 10 to 15 years that sought to reinforce domestic workers' rights, such as the ILO Convention itself, we know that among those 6.3 million declared workers, nearly 2 million of them do not effectively enjoy the same labor rights and social protection as other workers in their respective countries. Furthermore, undeclared work is a widespread phenomenon in the sector, and a third of all EU domestic workers are working undeclared. This afternoon's panel will tackle both the issue of what is needed to fill the regulatory gaps in the sector and increase domestic workers' levels of protection, as well as how can we successfully tackle undeclared work. Tomorrow morning, discussion will be focused on implementing rights, making them a reality to all domestic workers despite enforcement challenges. It will be followed by two thematic panels, respectively exploring how digital platform could act as a virtuous model to strengthen domestic worker status, and how decision makers can improve the situation of migrant domestic workers. From the outset, the commitment of the Alliance was to mainstream three key issues during all panels. Firstly, many presentations will address the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the sector. The COVID-19 crisis has highlighted both the essential contribution of those workers to our societies and the precarious working and living conditions a vast majority of them still face. So it was impossible for us not to address this issue. Secondly, almost 55% of domestic workers are migrant workers, majority of whom are migrant women. Therefore, the situation of migrant workers will be addressed in each panel. Finally, given the high density of female employment in the sector, we felt it was essential to also address the issue of working conditions in the sector in a gender equality perspective. Today, in addition to hosting this event, the C189 Alliance is issuing a report which seeks to provide an overview of the main challenges faced by the domestic work sector. It also allows some organizations and researchers to highlight their ongoing work. The report, whose link will shortly be copy-pasted in the chat, is available in English and will also be available in French, German, Spanish, and Polish by next week. In addition, joint letters calling for the ratification to the 19 member states who have not yet ratified the convention were sent earlier this morning. We also launched a selfie campaign on Twitter to which you are warmly invited to contribute. Our aim as the Alliance is to encourage key stakeholders to refine commitments of action and pledge towards improving domestic workers' rights. To do so, we want to encourage and inspire national stakeholders to organize their own national events. Two of them already took place in the past few weeks, respectively in Czech Republic and Spain, and we are glad that others are already planned. I therefore invite any of you who would be interested just to get in touch with us. It's time now to turn to our distinguished panel, as I know you are very much looking forward to today's events. I would like to welcome our three first speakers. Mr. Nicolas Schmit, European Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights, Mrs. Martha Newton, ILO's Deputy Director General for Policy, and Mr. Miguel Cabrita, Secretary of State for Labor and Vocational Training, and Deputy to the Minister at the Ministry of Labor, Solidarity and Social Security of Portugal. They will all share their views on the significance of the adoption of ILO Domestic Workers Convention and outline current challenges at national, European, and international level. So, without further ado, I now turn you over to Nicolas Schmit, European Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights. Mr. Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you very much, Ms. Decker, and thanks to all partners for organizing this event on the 10th anniversary of the ILO Domestic Workers Convention 189. I am proud that the European Commission is part of this wide initiative to promote decent work for domestic workers whose living situation has significantly worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic. 10 years ago, And I remember very well because I was a labor minister and I attended also the labor conference when the convention was adopted. The ILO Domestic Workers Convention was adopted with big joy, as we have seen. And it was urgent to improve because it was urgent to improve living and working conditions for the millions of these workers, mostly women, throughout the world. The convention has provided a solid framework. It has provided also a basis on which governments, social partners, and civil society organizations can move forward defending the rights of these workers. The EU has contributed its part on the implementation of the principles of the convention. Take working conditions, for instance. The convention calls on making sure domestic workers are informed of their conditions of employment in an appropriate manner. This is taken for granted, but in the EU, this right was not secured for all domestic workers until the adoption of a directive on transparent and predictable working conditions in 2019. Now, employers have to provide more complete information on the essential aspects of the work, and workers have the right to know a reasonable period in advance when they have to work. We are now also working on strengthening social dialogue and increasing minimum wages, which can have a very positive impact on the working conditions of domestic workers. Since 2011, the European Union has also promoted the ILO Domestic Workers Convention in its external relations. It is part of EU's external policy to fight forced labor, trafficking in human beings, discrimination, and violence at work, as well as to promote health and safety at work. Our development and cooperation policy, for example, includes a strong decent work dimension, and in some cases specifically addresses domestic work. Today, as we mark the 10th anniversary of this convention, we cannot afford any complacency. Despite the 2013 Council decision that called to facilitate the ratification of the convention, we have not yet achieved our objectives. Only 32 countries across the world have ratified the convention. Among them, 8 are EU member states. This means too many workers still work informally and do not earn a wage that enables them to live with dignity or to access social protection. And this includes things as essential as healthcare and maternity protection, but also the respect of working time. Mrs. Hopnan will later present some figures from the latest ILO report on the implementation of the convention, and they are alarming. One figure, for example, more than a third of domestic workers worldwide remain wholly excluded from labor protection. That is why today we must make a strong call in support of this essential convention. And I want to give you 4 good reasons to campaign for its ratification and its implementation. First of all, we have to support the need for care in our aging societies. The demand for care workers will indeed keep increasing due to our aging populations. It is estimated that over the next 50 years, the number of people who will develop age-related disabilities is likely to double in Europe, we will have to meet new needs, especially now that an increasing number of women work and cannot at the same time continue looking after their family members. To attract domestic workers who are care workers, for an important part, we will have to offer decent working conditions, adequate training, social protection, and fair wages. These are many of the principles promoted precisely by the Convention. A second reason to campaign for its ratification has to do with gender equality. Today, we all agree on this political priority, but we have to move from words to action, and improving the situation of domestic workers precisely provides an opportunity to make concrete positive changes for women, because in the EU, only 90% of domestic workers are women, and there are 9.5 million of them. In addition, domestic workers can also contribute to helping other women with their careers as they take care of household tasks. For the Commission, gender equality is an absolute priority, and especially also in the working environment. And therefore, we have made a proposal, for instance, on wage transparency, ensuring finally wage equality between men and women. A third reason I want to invoke is the risks that domestic workers run when their work is undeclared, which is very often the case. Undeclared domestic workers do not save for their pension, nor do they contribute to social security and healthcare. Because they are so invisible, they do not benefit from welfare, and it has become an enormous issue in the pandemic. Many could not benefit from income support and other public schemes. And this is absolutely unacceptable. And that is why undeclared work is a big focus on our action in the EU. And I'm grateful for our collaboration with the ILO on this topic. The wide ratification and implementation of the Convention would be another positive step to limit undeclared work. By the way, the European Union has created a platform to combat undeclared work, which is now integrated in the European Labour Authority. And certainly this platform also has to follow more specifically the issues of domestic workers. And as it was said at the beginning, undeclared work, domestic work are very much linked to migration. We all know that our care needs make migration absolutely indispensable. And therefore, we have to create the legal migration for domestic workers, because legal migration better prevents the situation of undeclared work and gives the migrants exactly the same social and labor rights they are entitled to. So as I heard, you will tackle this aspect of migration and fair working conditions and fighting undeclared work in the different debates. And finally, a last reason to call for a swift ratification of the ILO Convention on domestic workers has to do with social justice. We are rebuilding our economies with promises of greater redistribution of wealth and a fairer world of work. We are restarting our economies with promises to revalue people's work. And this should concern domestic workers as well. The pandemic has exposed the vulnerabilities of these workers, and at the same time, their invaluable contribution to societies and to families. We have discovered during the pandemic the importance of care. And I think this is, the pandemic has given us a big lesson on the value of care, and especially the rights of care workers. And we have to, not just to applaud them, be it in hospitals or be it the domestic care workers, we have also to recognize the value of their work in giving them fair working conditions and especially also better wages. In the past, care workers have often been looked down to, and now we have realized they are our frontline workers, especially in times of crisis. They are the women and men who looked after our children, to give us time and space to work from home. They are the women and men who looked after our parents or our relatives who may suffer from disabilities. We cannot let them continue to face so much insecurity about their labor rights, their income, and their future as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, now is the time to live up to the hopes, and we have seen how big the hopes were 10 years ago, raised with the adoption of the convention, and move forward with its ratification and implementation. And I call on renewed efforts to lift domestic work out of unacceptable conditions into fair and decent work. Let's follow the example of countries that have ratified this convention, like Portugal, the still president of the European Union, who has been very committed to promote social rights, especially at the Porto summit. And here in Portugal, we see already positive changes. Let's make together this step towards more social justice, more gender equality, more dignity at work, and in our societies, a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your speech. I hope that many member states and countries will hear your call for renewed effort towards ratification and implementation of the convention. I now turn to Mrs. Martha Newton. You are the ILO Deputy Director General for Policy. What is your international perspective on the achievements since the adoption of the convention, and what are the challenges ahead?
Well, thank you so much. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be with you all here today on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the ILO Convention on Decent Work for Domestic Workers. I know that there are many of you who have worked very hard to make this event a success, but I'd like to just thank you, Ms. Decker, for the invitation, and to all the other partners who have coordinated this exceptional and important event. And also thank you to Commissioner Schmidt for your leadership and outlining the very important reasons why we all need to make ratification of Convention 189 a priority. So let me take you a little bit of history. So this was a convention that was historic in so many ways. It recognized the work that domestic workers play, an essential role in meeting the care needs of many millions of households. It recognized the contribution of domestic workers to increasing paid job opportunities for workers with family responsibilities. But most importantly, it recognized for the first time that domestic workers were real workers who should benefit from rights and protections. And C189 is also essentially an instrument of equality and non-discrimination, although many people may not immediately think of that. The ILO estimates that women continue to make up 3/4 of the over 75 million domestic workers ages 15 years and older in the world. The proportion of women is highest in Latin America and the Caribbean, and in Europe. Latin America, it's 91%, in Europe, and 89%. Domestic workers are often migrants from indigenous groups or from marginalized communities. And these domestic workers face multiple forms of discrimination. So in calling on member states to include domestic workers within the scope of labor laws, Convention 189 calls for the elimination of discrimination against women, migrants, ethnic and racial minorities, and others. And it also calls for the equality of treatment in calling on member states to ensure that domestic workers can enjoy the same rights equivalent to those of other workers. But the reality today stands in stark contrast to the initial vision and objectives of C189. As you'll hear from my ILO colleague, Claire Hobden, later in this opening session, in honor of the 10th anniversary of the convention, the ILO has published a report that takes stock of progress that's been made in the last 10 years, both in terms of legal rights and protections and the implementation of those rights and protections. And this report is the first ever attempt to measure the level of protection enjoyed by domestic workers worldwide. So I want to start with some good news. Today, there's been an increase in 15 percentage points in the proportion of domestic workers who are legally recognized as workers. 88% of countries cover domestic workers either through their general labor laws, specific regulations, or a combination of the two. But most progress has been made in the area of working time. But important legal deficits still exist, particularly in the areas of minimum wage and maternity protection. So you perhaps won't be surprised to know that these rights have yet to become a reality for most domestic workers. And in fact, one can argue that the situation has worsened. We're coming together at a time when the world has faced one of the most devastating pandemics. And domestic workers, as Commissioner Smith has stated, as frontline care workers, have been directly impacted, either because they lost their jobs or because they continued to work at the height of the contagion. If the COVID pandemic has taught us anything, it's the importance of our homes as shelter, as sanctuary, and as workplaces. In an effort to curb the spread of the virus, millions of employees moved their offices into their living rooms. Their children were often schooled from home. Many of us experienced unprecedented household responsibilities. And in some cases, households that had previously employed domestic workers could no longer count on their support, whether it was due to confinement measures, financial strains, or medical reasons. During the crisis, domestic workers have been more likely to lose their jobs or see their hours and wages reduced than other employees. Compared with the last quarter of 2019, job losses among domestic workers were on the average 3 times higher to other employees in 20 countries across all regions. In most countries reviewed, domestic workers who kept their jobs saw a 50% reduction in working hours. The fate of these domestic workers who lost their jobs depended all too much on whether they were formally employed. You see, 8 out of 10 domestic workers are informally employed, and that means that they don't have Social Security to fall back on. The low wages of domestic workers, who earn just 56% average monthly wages, also mean that few of them had savings that could tide them over. And in the EU 27, domestic workers weren't spared. Despite extensive legal coverage, close to 65% of domestic workers are informally employed, and their wages are low compared to average monthly wages of other employees. Because of these issues, the pandemic has exacerbated long-standing problems in the domestic work sector, making even more urgent the need to formalize domestic work. While legal gaps remain an issue in some regions and others, the main issue is the reason of implementation, and that is to make decent work a reality for all domestic workers. Of the 34.9 million domestic workers who are covered by labor and Social Security laws, close to 60% are not in practice covered. They're still informally employed and as a result, lack effective protection on key workplace issues, such as the hours they work, occupational safety and health, and violence and harassment at work. Implementation is key in EU countries where domestic workers are largely covered by labor and social security laws, yet the majority are still working informally. Thankfully, the last 10 years have generated an increasing amount of practical knowledge on how to close this implementation gap. Many good practices are found in our report, and I know that we'll be hearing of many more good practices throughout this event. We've seen new efforts to increase Social Security registration among domestic workers, using innovative approaches like digital technology and behavioral science. We've also seen the development of the capacities of public authorities to promote and enforce compliance. Progress has even been made on achieving collective bargaining in the sector, and that's really important to note. Taken together, these show that making decent work a reality for domestic workers is entirely possible. We know that centuries of exclusion cannot be erased in just a few years. Formalization of domestic work, decent working conditions will take time and continued efforts from governments, workers and employers organizations, the ILO, and civil society. In this respect, Convention 189, together with other ILO standards, including our core conventions, and Convention 190 on violence and harassment at work, are essential tools that can provide guidance on how to improve laws and practices. The transformative and human-centered agenda for decent work outlined in the ILO Centenary Declaration provides further guidance. And that progress that has been made so far is an extension of labor and social protections, highlight the role that labor standards such as C189 play in improving the protection of vulnerable groups. The stories behind these changes in law underscore the often underestimated role of international labor standards as powerful tools of empowerment, in this case for domestic workers and their organizations. And indeed, and you saw in the video, Convention 189 is unique in how it has been embraced by the domestic workers themselves. So in conclusion, let's remember why progress on domestic workers' conditions is so important, not just for domestic workers themselves, but for all workers. Domestic workers are an essential part of the infrastructure that allows households to meet their care needs. And the COVID-19 pandemic has reinforced this unequivocally. Domestic workers also make an enormous contribution to the overall gender inequality because they help their employers, in particular women, join and stay in the paid labor market. And this benefits us all, regardless of where we work or live. As we work towards policies that can create a sustainable and equitable recovery from the current crisis, we must ensure that domestic workers are not left behind. This is particularly of concern in countries where aging populations and continued preferences for in-home over institutional care. It's time that domestic workers became not only contributors to, but also beneficiaries of a transformative agenda for gender equality, as called for in the Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work, and also recently strongly reaffirmed just a week ago at the closing of the International Labor Conference through a resolution concerning a global call to action for human-centered recovery. As we heard multiple times during the International Labor Conference, the impact of the pandemic has a feminine face, and their situation provides one additional and compelling reason among many for the ILO's full commitment to taking concrete action to make decent work a reality for all domestic workers. So I just want to thank all of the members who are here today of the C189 Alliance for your efforts over the last 10 years. And as we heard in that powerful opening video, we have not reached the end of the road yet. I know that this event today will serve to re-energize all of our efforts to ensure that we have a future where domestic workers have the same rights and freedoms as other workers, not only in the EU, but across the globe. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Newton, for your inspiring speech and for highlighting so well that the issue of decent working conditions for domestic workers is not only an issue for domestic workers themselves, but for the society as a whole. I will now turn to Mr. Miguel Cabrita, Secretary of State for Labor Vocational Training of Portugal, representing the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union, but also one of the 8 member states who ratified the convention. Please, Mr. Cabrita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I would like to greet all the partners, all the participants, all the institutions as well, Commissioner Schmidt, the ILO, domestic workers around the world, and greet very especially the European Federation for Services to Individuals for organizing also today's event and to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the ILO Convention 189 on decent work for domestic workers. First of all, I'd like to say that the adoption of this convention was a cornerstone towards the recognition and protection of domestic workers' rights. But as we all know, the convention also entails a crucial responsibility that policymakers around the globe must bear in mind. That's why it is so important that we are here today, 10 years on, to underline the importance of the ratification of such an important instrument, such an important labor standard, to assess what progresses have been achieved, and also, of course, to discuss the current challenges on the effective implementation of the convention. At this time, as you already mentioned, 8 European Union member states, including Portugal, have already ratified the convention. I must say, speaking on behalf of the Portuguese presidency, and a few weeks after the Porto Social Summit that has already been mentioned also by Commissioner Schmidt, I cannot but underscore the importance of this debate, considering also the commitments achieved within the European Union in order to further implement the European Pillar of Social Rights at such an important moment for the European Union and the world, also in the context of COVID, which is a very, very complex and challenging context, which has exacerbated inequalities and precarious situations. So in this context, and 10 years after the convention, my first words in these contextual elements must also be an appeal, a call to more countries, including member states in the European Union, to ratify the convention and proceed with the expansion of this framework for decent work standards for domestic workers. Ladies and gentlemen, let me say that the convention emphasizes, as you know, the economic and social importance of domestic work in an increasingly more global world. In fact, these workers, as has been mentioned, play a fundamental role in the area of care, for instance, caring for children, the elderly, the disabled, often among the most vulnerable. They also perform a significant diversity of tasks, from cleaning to gardening to cooking to laundry to driving to many areas of work that often remain invisible, that often are not valued enough, but that are crucial for our social systems, not to mention our households and communities as a whole. It must also be said that these workers can be employed directly by households, but in many cases through service providers. So they often work on different premises for multiple employers, and this adds to the specific features and complexities of domestic work. Bearing in mind the data published by the European Commission, the estimates show that around 4% of the total employment on average in the EU are domestic workers. And the existence of international labor standards represents, therefore, a milestone in recognizing domestic workers as workers that are fully entitled to labor rights and protection. They must be equal to other workers. And these are, as we know, workers that often face difficult situations, that are in invisible private workplaces, that pose specific and higher risks for decent work. This is also why, at the same time, this convention has been and must continue to be a reference and a guide to tackle the still existing exclusions of domestic workers from some labor rights and social protections. Of course, in many cases, even worse when they are undeclared workers. I don't have the ambition here to provide for a comprehensive analysis of the convention, but I do want to underscore some of its most prominent elements and passages. And recalling that the convention specifically proclaims that domestic workers are, like other workers, entitled to freedom of association, effectiveness of the right to collective bargaining, eliminating all forms of forced and compulsory labor, the effective abolition of child labor throughout the world, across the world, and also the elimination of forms of discrimination in respect of employment, occupation, and other criteria. In this sense, the respect of fundamental principles and rights at work goes beyond, strictly speaking, of labor issues. It goes even beyond social protection. I think this is one of the areas in which we are at the core of decent work values. It's a matter of protection of human rights, truly human rights. To access the access to fully regulated domestic work with fair forms of employment, about which the worker must be properly informed, it's an important requirement to improve living conditions and this access to human rights, and to the increase to paid job opportunities, favoring the transition from precarious, often undeclared situations to the formal and protected economy. According to the convention, and with due regard to the specific features of domestic work in the context of social dialogue, it's the governments that have the responsibility to promote equal treatment between domestic workers and other workers. It's the governments that have this responsibility, and it must not be declined, namely regarding working time, remuneration, occupational safety and health, social security, and other aspects of decent work. The convention has been an important step, I would say a fundamental step. Since 2010, governments around the world, and some elements and data have already been mentioned, of course, with the cooperation of social partners, but governments have truly made efforts in order to better identify and protect workers, namely by extending the coverage of labor and social security laws. According to the ILO estimates, as has been said, the number of domestic workers that were included under the scope of additional labor laws was increased by around 15% since 2010. It's good, but I would say we must not be happy with that. We must go further down this road. Because despite this progress, we recognize that there is still a lot of work to do. Domestic workers still struggle to be fully recognized as any other worker and as professionals who provide essential services, facing sometimes or often situations where their rights are not respected. Sometimes it's easy when you talk about some certain forms of work in daily life, in invisible workplaces, to forget the degree of consolidation of dignity of work, of social dialogue, of regulated and stable labor markets with recognized labor rights is not a reality in many parts of the world and even sometimes in our own societies. So the domestic labor sector is a great example of this reality, and we must fight this, and we must continue to fight this. We must reduce the exposure to low levels of remuneration, to excessive working hours, to risks of health and safety that sometimes put these workers in very vulnerable situations, especially the so-called live-in workers who live in their own place of work. This, of course, can be aggravated by the high incidence of undeclared work, because these workers are particularly vulnerable to injuries, to diseases, to death, to poverty in general, as this means more difficulties or even impossibility to access healthcare and social benefits. In informal economy, as we know, the denial of rights at work, the absence of adequate opportunities and quality employment are exacerbated, and undeclared work is among the most extreme forms of precariousness, and it is fully incompatible with the principles, values, spirits, and also the reality or even prospect of decent work. Informality, undeclared work, has no place in an inclusive labor market in a decent society. Undeclared work is unworthy and unacceptable in all respects, and it has a negative impact on the development of societies and economy, deepening poverty, hindering the realization of the rule of law, curtailing social development, curtailing also economic development from the perspective of the employers, the perspective of the state, and of course, the perspective of workers themselves, especially those who are not recognized as such. It is not by chance, therefore, that undeclared work has been a priority for years in many countries, including my own country, and on an European scale. It is fair and it is critical that it be so and remains to be so in the future. To conclude, I would like to say that combating informality and promoting fair and decent work conditions in the domestic sector, which is still mostly provided by women, and I would like to underline that as well, must be a priority. As recognized by the European Union, there can be no employment relations, regardless of their nature, that are not covered by rights and social protection. And this point is critical, especially in the context of the future of work and connected challenges. The role of public authorities on a preventive perspective, on a regulatory perspective, but also on an inspective perspective is very critical. I can also affirm, speaking not only as presidency, but also representing a member state, that Portugal is very committed to improve its own legal framework concerning domestic work, to deepen the protection of domestic workers, to combat informality in the sector, and to further prevent and combat undeclared work in any form of non-declared economic activity. It is safe to say we have come a long way, both on the national and European levels, but for all these reasons, the path we have taken is still unfinished, and this is why it's so important to deepen the process of ratification of the convention within EU member states and also other countries around the world. I'm sure that today's debate will make solid contributions to identify the challenges, also to assess the progress. We hope also to have more information about how the EU itself can contribute to achieving the common goals and to fully implement the convention. But we are very committed to pursue these critical steps, to deepen our commitment, to go further down this road, and to ensure the adequacy and the effectiveness, above all, of all the ILO provisions, not only on domestic work, but all of the labor standards. These are critical steps. It's a critical task for all of us in the name of well-functioning labor markets, in the name of labor and social standards, and in the name of cohesion and social justice. It's a priority for domestic workers, but also for our societies, for our social models, that we must not postpone. I wish you a good day of work and all the best for your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cabrita. You rightly pointed out that government has a responsibility to go down the road on making efforts to improve the domestic workers' working condition. The aim of the Alliance this morning, by sending a letter to each government who have not ratified the convention yet, was also a way for the Alliance members to demonstrate their willingness to be involved in a dialogue and to help improving the situation at national level. I know that due to other commitments you have to leave. I thank you very much again for being with us this morning. I now turn to Ogden, ILO policy officer specialized on domestic workers. On the 16th of June this year, the ILO published a flagship report on domestic work, taking stock of the progress made so far. We had some preview of its content, and we are very happy that you was able to join us this morning to give us a more detailed overview of the findings of this report.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I just want to join my fellow panelists in thanking and appreciating the efforts of the C189 Alliance in planning this fabulous event. I think it will go a long way to helping us move forward along the path towards making decent work a reality for domestic workers. I will indeed be sharing some key highlights from the report this morning, for which I will now share my screen. So, as we've heard already this morning, the adoption of Convention 189 was a historic moment. And I think that what we really wanted to do with the adoption of, or with the development of this report, is to highlight, taking from the convention as a baseline, highlighting what progress has been made, both in terms of the law, but also in terms of implementation. This is because, of course, the title of the convention and the spirit of the convention is to make decent work a reality. So, you know, there's the element of the labor laws, there's the element of ensuring that the labor laws are providing adequate and equal levels of protection for domestic workers, and the third aspect, which is really implementation. So the report follows a similar structure. The first part of the report really looks at the global estimates on the number of domestic workers, a little bit about their profile, the occupational profile. The second part of the report then looks at legal protections, and the final part looks at implementation of those legal protections. When we look at the implementation, it's measured both in terms of informality, wages, working time, but we also provide good practices to close those implementation gaps. And I would say right from the start of this presentation that what we really hope to achieve with this report is that countries, governments, social partners, other stakeholders will be able to take the good practices related to some of the gaps in their own countries and invest in them more deeply. Because I think this is one of the ways in which we can accelerate progress towards making decent work a reality for domestic workers. So to turn to some of the findings, the first part on the number and characteristics of domestic workers. Now, for the first time, we were able to develop a more accurate methodology on capturing the number of domestic workers globally. As many of you know, it is not very easy to collect data on domestic workers for numerous reasons. And in the past, we were really only able to capture domestic workers who were employed directly by households. Pleased to say that we were able to, in particular also with the help and dialogue with Jean-François Lebrun, who we will be hearing from later, to expand on this methodology to also include domestic workers hired through service providers. So with that in mind, I mean, what we're trying to do is capture the full scope of the convention, which really includes domestic workers hired through service providers or directly by the household. So with that in mind, we now estimate that there are 75 million domestic workers in the world. As you can see in Europe and Central Asia, there are 3.5 million. And I have to specify here that this number is unfortunately not as accurate as we would like it to be. And the reasons for this is that this is precisely the region in which we were not able to collect data on domestic workers hired through service providers, at least not to do so in a way that was fully reliable. Now, the problem is that in the labor force surveys, we didn't have access to the right level of data to be able to capture that. So this is a very low end, a very low estimate. And I think that it bears repeating that, you know, if you look at the estimates on personal and household services at the European level, I think they estimate that about 30% are hired directly through households and 70% are hired through service providers. So it gives you a sense that this 3.5 million would correspond roughly to the 30%, and that there's another 70% of domestic workers that are working in the European Union. So actually, specifically in the EU, we estimate there are 2.4 million working directly for households. You would have to add an additional 70% on top of that. So globally, domestic work represents about 2.3% of employment or 4.5% of employees. it really holds a huge weight in some regions like the Arab states, and you can see here in the bars that domestic workers represent 14.8% of employees in Arab states, and they also represent a particularly high percentage of female employment in some regions, particularly in Latin America, which you can see here. So globally, there's 76% of domestic workers who are women. But again, there are variations in the distribution in different regions. So men actually outnumber women in certain regions, like in the Arab states. And if you look at the sub-regional level, which is not featured here, Southern Asia as well and Northern Africa are two regions where men either outnumber women or their proportions are very close. So this changes a little bit the gender understandings that we had in the past, and might also influence certain approaches in those regions. But we have to say that across the board, domestic work represents only a small share of employment among men, whereas again, among women, it can represent a higher share of employment. So it still is a more important source of employment for women than for men. So to turn to the extension of protection by labor and social security laws, we heard already some of the big lines, so I'm going to look at some of the specifics. I think across the board, we do see a trend towards including domestic workers in the labor laws, to use a combination of instruments in order to afford that protection. And across all policy areas that we looked at, there is a tendency towards equality, meaning that when labor laws are extended to domestic workers, they tend to do so on an equal footing with other workers. Now, that's not always the case, but normally when we've estimated the percentage of countries or percentage of domestic workers who are covered by labor laws, they tend to be included on an equal footing. So here you see the coverage by national labor laws. At the top, you see the percentage of countries that provide these laws. And below, you see the percentage of domestic workers who are covered as a result of those countries providing such coverage. So there are some significant, let's say, there are some countries that employ a huge number of domestic workers that influences the share of domestic workers who are covered, right? So for example, you know, I think you see in the Americas, there's Brazil that employs a huge number of domestic workers. In Asia, of course, we have China. And so oftentimes you'll see a very low percentage of domestic workers who are covered by a certain provision. And it's actually just because they're excluded in one of the countries that happens to employ a lot of domestic workers. So for this reason, we do try to provide both the percentage of countries who provide coverage and also the percentage of domestic workers who are covered as a result of those countries having adopted laws and policies. The other general trend that I want to stop on is that there are regions where legal gaps are still very significant and others where the extent of legal coverage is quite complete. So typically in Europe and Central Asia and in the Americas, you see very high levels of legal protection, but in other regions such as in the Arab states and Asia and the Pacific, the extent of labor coverage still is very low. There are, however, improvements across the board. So if you look at the different policy areas that we covered in the report in terms of working time, wages, and maternity protection, you see here the change in percentage points, right? So you have an increase of 15 percentage points in the proportion of domestic workers who are covered by general or specific labor laws. But then we also look at the specific provisions on working time in terms of entitlement to weekly rest, paid annual leave, and limits on normal weekly hours of work. For wages, we look at minimum wage coverage and whether or not that minimum wage can be paid as paid in kind, or if payment in kind is prohibited. And for maternity protection, we look at maternity leave entitlements and maternity cash benefits. So if this is a measure of progress, then what we see is that there's been the least progress in terms of minimum wage coverage at 2.9%, and the most progress made in the area of weekly rest. So again, this is just looking at the percent change and just looking at those domestic workers who are now entitled to equal rights with respect to each of the policy areas. So just to give an example, so that's the change in percentage points in the number of domestic workers who are covered. This slide is now looking at the current situation today. So in 2020, these are the percentages of countries that provide equal rights with respect to each of the policy areas. So you see this trend again, right, where there's 50% of domestic workers who are entitled to the same limits on normal weekly hours as other workers. With weekly rest and annual leave, there's 78% of countries that provide such equal entitlements. With minimum wage and payment in kind, you have 65% roughly and 37%. So for the 37% here are domestic workers, are the countries that, that prohibit a portion of the minimum wage from being paid in kind. And with maternity leave, again, the coverage rates are relatively high. But again, this leaves important gaps remaining. So you see in the gray color is the percentage of countries that have excluded domestic workers from these rights altogether. So we still have a ways to go in closing those gaps. So just to note an example on normal hours of work, you see here that there is the same variation, let's say, in terms of the regional coverage. At the global level, you have 35% of domestic workers who are entitled to equal rights with respect to normal hours of work. That number is very high in the Americas and Europe and Central Asia, where you have 83 and 87%. And in the EU, you see coverage rate of 93.8%. So it's quite high as well. You'll see relatively the same patterns in terms of weekly rest and paid annual leave, where I think in the EU 27 domestic workers are about 100% or 99 point something percent of domestic workers are covered by those labor laws. So again, for minimum wage, just to provide the example, you see the same patterns again in the Americas, 90 and in Europe and Central Asia, 98% of domestic workers are covered. And in strong contrast to that, you see the Arab states in Asia and the Pacific. And Africa always lands a little bit somewhere in the middle. There also tends to be a higher tendency in Africa to provide rights, but not on an equal footing with other workers. So here you see 32% that have less favorable entitlements with respect to minimum wage. But again, in EU 27, there are about 99% of domestic workers who are covered by minimum wage to the same extent as other workers. And finally, maternity protection. So you see that well, we looked at both maternity leave and maternity cash benefits. Here is just cash benefits. The tendency is that when governments provide maternity leave, they also provide maternity cash benefits, although not always, but it does tend in that direction. And you see again the same sort of patterns, but even more strongly, Arab states 100% excluded, Europe and Central Asia 100% included, and in the EU 27 again 100% covered. So we also looked at social security laws here because we didn't have the same baseline data. We couldn't measure the percent change over the last 10 years, but we did look at the percentage of countries who provide all benefits, the percentage of countries that provide at least one benefit, and the percentage of domestic workers who are covered as a result. Now here the gaps are really big, even in the law. There are very few countries that provide all benefits, all social security branches to domestic workers. Globally, that number is at 14.9%. And even in the regions that provide high levels of legal coverage, such as in the Americas and in Europe and Central Asia, you see that only 14.7% and 47.4% respectively provide all benefits. Now in the EU 27, that number looks like 66.7% of domestic workers who are covered by all social security branches, and 99% that are entitled to at least one branch of social security. And I think it's really important to mention here that coverage by unemployment benefits is the lowest across the board, not just in the EU 27, but globally. And since the pandemic hit and domestic workers, even those who were formally employed, often did not have access to unemployment benefits as a result of this gap in protection. So a few words about whether these rights have become a reality. We looked at the percentage of domestic workers in informal employment, and as we heard in the opening remarks, 81% of domestic workers are still in informal employment, which is twice the share of informal employment among other employees. Now in the EU 27, we have a very stark difference as well. There's 64% of domestic workers who are in informal employment, which is 4.5 times that of other employees. So domestic workers are really disproportionately affected in that sense by informal employment. We also looked at the actual working time of domestic workers. So 64% of domestic workers work outside the range of normal hours compared to 46% of other employees. Domestic workers tend to work either very short hours or very long hours. And for the EU 27, as with most high income and high middle income countries, domestic workers tend to work very short hours. So we found that more than a quarter of domestic workers work less than 35 hours per week compared to 14% among other employees. Long hours affect domestic workers more in Asia and the Pacific and in the Arab states. And in EU 27, there's 35% of domestic workers who work less than 20 hours a week and about 32% who work 35 to 48 hours compared to 67.4% of other workers. So you see this strong tendency, and it's very important because in fact, there's a strong correlation, not just with wages, but also with the level of informal employment. So we don't show the figures here, but there is a higher tendency of domestic workers working informally to work a lower number of hours, and vice versa. There's a higher tendency of domestic workers who work few hours to be informally employed. And we relate this very strongly to threshold provisions that limit entry of domestic workers to Social Security registration. So in terms of wages, we heard before that domestic workers earn just 56% of average wages worldwide. In the EU 27, that figure is about 52%. So the wage gap is still very significant for domestic workers. And we have to relate this to the fact that there are very few hours of work that they're working. So even though domestic workers in Europe might be the most highly paid compared to other regions, their wages are very low compared to other employees within the region. There's an interesting portion of the report that I encourage you to look at more closely that estimates the impact of non-compliance, the incidence of non-compliance among domestic work and other workers in terms of wages, and also what would happen if there was full compliance. And what we find is that the proportion of domestic workers who fall below the minimum wage is triple or quadruple the rate of non-compliance of other employees. So it's extremely high. And if there were full compliance, we would actually help close not just the pay gap between domestic workers and other employees, but also reduce wage inequality and poverty. So this is very important in achieving the SDGs. These are some of the key indicators. So finally, we looked also at occupational safety and health and violence and harassment. For both, we didn't manage to do quantitative data collection, but we did do sort of a qualitative assessment of some of the risk factors for both OSH and violence and harassment. Needless to say that these are some of the most, let's say, day-to-day challenges that domestic workers face, and also some of the most difficult to identify, being that both occur behind closed doors. So the privacy of the household and the lack of recognition of the household as a place of work are both really important risk factors in a sense here, together with also negative stereotypes, the isolation, power imbalances, and of course the exclusion from labor and social security laws that combine here to create some of the most vulnerable situations. We've heard some data on impact of COVID-19. I think that the most important figures to take into account here is that, well, for the EU 27, for the countries that we reviewed, between the fourth quarter of 2019 and the second quarter of 2020, we found that there was a decrease in the number of domestic workers of 22.7%, for example, in Slovakia, 13% in Italy and Portugal. But also for those who remained in employment, domestic workers faced a significant impact on their working hours. So we saw a reduction of 78% of working hours in Slovakia, and about 47% in Portugal and 21% in Italy. So even though they kept their jobs, they saw a big reduction in their working hours, which obviously affected their wages. So finally, we estimated the size of the gap of the deficits of protection, let's say. So what we wanted to do is say, among those domestic workers who are informal, what share of them are informal due to gaps in legal protection and which share are informal due to gaps in implementation. We found that, and this is perhaps a little obvious now, in regions where the legal coverage is highest, implementation gaps are the largest. So Europe and Central Asia, the implementation gap is 97%. Needless to say, this makes it very important to focus not just on closing legal gaps and ensuring an adequate level of protection that's at least equal to that of other workers, but also to focus on implementation gaps. And here, I just want to end on a few key points. I think that the experience of the EU 27 countries, or several countries within the EU 27 at least, is some of the most advanced in the world. We also have some very good examples in other regions, new examples of collective bargaining from Sao Paulo in Brazil, and more efforts on bargaining in Argentina. So there are movements in the direction, but the experiences in some countries in Europe are certainly older and more advanced in many ways, particularly when it comes to formalization. Even though informality is still very high in Europe, some of the systems that are in place are without a doubt helping to promote formalization. So I think this really highlights the importance of knowledge sharing across countries, including through South-South cooperation around some of the lessons learned so far in terms of ensuring formal employment, to make sure that it's more attractive than informal employment. We know a lot of this already, and I think the question is really to actually take these examples and pilot them. We need to pilot them, test them, implement them in new countries. More recently in Mexico, they used digital technology. Actually, it was implemented partly because of COVID-19 to prevent or allow employers of domestic workers to register and pay their contributions to Social Security without having to go to the bank during the pandemic. So this digital technology was created with the pandemic, but has had a huge impact, and I think is worth replicating in other countries to make sure that registration procedures are simple enough for employers of domestic workers. I think that the notion of building the capacity of the authorities to monitor and promote and enforce compliance is an area that needs a lot more work still, but there are good examples in different parts of the world where there have been specific entities that have been established, or teams. For example, the Labor Tribunal in Argentina or the Labor Inspectorate in Uruguay, that are examples that are maybe getting to be quite well known. But again, what we're not seeing is the piloting of such efforts in new countries. So it's a question, I think, now of increasing exchanges between countries on how to do these kinds of interventions and to build up from there. And finally, I think the simplicity of promoting compliance through awareness raising. We know that awareness raising is not sufficient, but it's also impossible to expect increased compliance and implementation without it. And I think that there's room still for more regular campaigning of public information campaigns to employers of domestic workers, to households, and to domestic workers themselves to make sure that they're aware of their rights and responsibilities. Skills training, recognition, and professionalization is an area that can also deserve a lot more attention and investment, because this will improve the quality of services to households and also helps to raise the profile of domestic work in general. We need to start seeing domestic work as a real service to households and as a part of the services that are essential to the functioning of households. This to me is really about recognition of the skills that domestic workers are already bringing to the table. And finally, these skills training centers can also work to implement rights through written contracts when domestic workers are hired from training centers, and other entities can also play this role. So finally, voice and representation. There are a lot of examples in the report of how social dialogue and collective bargaining and just generally the role of domestic workers organizations and the role of employers of domestic workers in their organizations has been fundamental in ensuring equal rights and in ensuring that the policies and laws that are adopted are reflective of the realities of the sector. I think for domestic work, almost more so than any other sector, it's important to have households represented because they are absolutely a key stakeholder in all of this. And in that respect, this event that we're having is so unique because the organizations of employers that are represented here don't exist in other regions. And so I can only encourage more exchange to happen also with other countries, with other efforts that we're seeing in other places to see how we can build on the knowledge that has already been developed here in Europe. So I'll leave my comments there. I know I've already gone over time. I appreciate your patience and thank you again for the opportunity to share this report with you all.
Thank you very much, Claire, for your presentation that raised many interest in the audience. I can only invite everybody who want to deepen and continue the discussion about what Claire has presented to join the Wonder platform after the panel. Now I will turn to Mrs. Caroline Schill, which is the director of the European Institute for Gender Equality. Then the issue of gender and gender equality in the sector has been raised by many speakers already this morning. So, Mrs. Skills, we are looking forward to hearing what are your thoughts on this very important topic.
Thank you, Ms. Decker, and good morning, everybody. It is very nice to be here today to speak about how we can bring more gender equality into the domestic work sector. And let's repeat the obvious, it has been said already, but the rights of domestic workers and the quality of their jobs are gender equality issues. Let me repeat some figures. In the EU, 95% of domestic cleaners and helpers are women. When it comes to those who provide professional care at home, 83% are women. And that's just the figures that are declared. I am sure that many of us present here today have hired someone to help us at home, to clean our house, for example, or to take care of our aging parents. And I'm sure that more often than not, these helpers were women. Because the official data is clear, domestic work is predominantly done by women. The same is true of unpaid domestic labor, which still falls largely on the shoulders of women. Indeed, for some people here today, especially for women, hiring someone to help with caring and household tasks will have been the only way you have been able to take up paid work, because otherwise you would have been doing it yourself. Why? Because domestic labor is critical. Without caring, cooking and cleaning, none of us would get very far. Our societies would quite literally fall apart. Yet, domestic work includes some of the most underpaid and undervalued jobs in the labor market. For example, 82% of domestic cleaners and helpers are among the 20% lowest paid people in the European Union. Please remember that the vast majority of these workers are women. That means that a very large chunk of the EU's lowest paid people are women. Working conditions of domestic workers are also often poor, with some facing abuse and degrading treatment from their employers. This is partly enabled by the informal nature of much domestic work, with many workers not protected by labor laws nor eligible for social security. Many domestic workers come from a different country to where they are working and are at risk of exploitation. So why is domestic work so undervalued? Part of the reason must surely be because it is carried out in the home, which is still not seen as a place where real work takes place. I saw a study published in the UK recently, which highlighted the so-called hidden costs of later retirement for women, as they would no longer be able to provide free of charge care for their older relatives in the home. Instead, the state would have to take on this cost, which the authors of the study seem to suggest should be provided by women for free instead. There was no suggestion that retired men should be taking on some of care load, or that the state should be providing more support. This is illustrative of how much we value work done in the home, which is not very much at all. So it is perhaps little wonder that we don't pay domestic workers decent salaries or even give them much respect. They are doing something that we expect women to do for free in their own households, instead of the real work that is done outside the home. So how do we improve the quality of domestic work to better reflect its importance? The legal route is critical. Domestic workers must be included in all national labor, healthcare, social care, and anti-discrimination laws. Informal workers should be brought into the official labor market so they are protected from exploitation. All domestic workers should be able to join trade unions. The ILO's Domestic Workers Convention and the EU's Directive on Transparent and Predictable Working Conditions are vital tools to achieve these aims. It is interesting to see that one of the EU countries which has ratified the ILO's convention is also one of the countries where much has been done to improve the situation of domestic workers. In Belgium, the state manages the relationship between households needing domestic services and domestic workers. Because domestic services are subsidized, households are incentivized to go via the formal route, which provides domestic workers with increased security. This approach is also important because it recognizes domestic work as something that all households may need, and that the state is in a position to provide. Not as something that half of Belgium's population, women, should be providing free of charge. This immediately raises the cachet of domestic work. Something you pay for is something you value. Because domestic work is mainly done by women, this can help raise the perceived value of so-called women's work, such as caring, cleaning, and cooking. With our societies aging and set to need more and more care, this is essential. We will need more domestic workers who should be treated well. We will also be needing more men to join these professions if we are to satisfy demand. In some places of the labor market, we could be seeing the first winds of change. EIGE recently conducted a study that has not been released yet, which found that across a sample of 10 EU member states, some 46% of people providing housekeeping and other home services via online platforms are men. This is obviously dramatically different to the 5% of men providing such services in the traditional labor market. While we cannot make a direct comparison between the two figures, as they may not include exactly the same kinds of services, this is yet an extremely interesting development to watch. So, to summarize, in order to achieve gender equality in domestic work, we need this work to be formalized, we need it to be respected, and we need it to include more men. All things I believe we can achieve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very interesting speech. You rightly emphasize the fact that even when it's unpaid, housework and care work is usually undervalued, and this is really linked to the issue of raising the profile of domestic workers and raising their, improving their working condition. I'm afraid we have already out of time, so we have to close this introductory session now. I would like to thank again all our speakers for joining us this morning, and I would like to invite all participants and speakers included to continue the discussion on the Wonder platform we have set up, which is a platform which should enable you to have some informal networking and chat with all participants as if we were in a in-person meeting. So please do not hesitate to join the event on Wonder. During the break, we will start again at 2 o'clock this afternoon, Brussels time, for the first panel. So thank you very much to all, and looking forward to seeing you all this afternoon. Bye.